Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we are going to talk about an excellent wintertime fishing bait. If your water is still open right now, this is going to be a technique that you should be throwing. This is going to be one of the first techniques I throw this spring, and if you've been watching the channel for some time, you know that I've been doing these videos where we talk about the rigging inside here, focus on all the details on how to rig a bait up, and then we go out on the water in a different video and actually learn how to fish this thing and go over all of that. So in the spring, this is going to be one of the first baits we talk about once I get my boat back out, and that bait's going to be the Damiki Rig. So today we're going to talk all about how to rig this thing up, everything you need to know about rod and reel setup, line, baits you should choose, jig heads, how to put it on the jig head, and then in a different video we'll actually go out on the water and fish this thing, hopefully catch a bunch of bass on it. So stay tuned, let's get right into it. So first off, what is the Damiki Rig and what makes it so special? If you've never heard of the Damiki Rig before, all this is a small plastic that looks like a minnow and a jig head. It's basically like the finesse swim bait setup that I throw, except you fish it a little bit differently and it will work in even colder water. This is more a suspended fish technique. If you fish for a lot of fish that chase bait, they'll get out on big flats and roam and chase bait. We have a lot of that up here in the Northeast. Whether it's smallmouth, they'll get out on these big flats with rock, chase schools of shad around on these lakes, and they'll suspend for them, especially in cold water. They won't chase them very quickly, but they'll kind of just follow these big schools of shad around. And if you can get on top of them, whether it's with 2D sonar, which I used to do, now I have forward-facing sonar, so if you can get on top of them with that as well, it is an extra way to catch these fish on this technique. That's one way we like to catch them a lot. The other thing we do a lot of times in the spring here, if you ice fish for largemouth, you know where these fish like to go in the winter time. They get in these brush piles. So it's same thing, there'll be big flats. They just might not be feeding on shad. They could still feed on shad if your lake has shad. There's a couple lakes by my house where we don't have shad, but they get in these brush piles in like 15 to 20 foot of water, and they eat baby bluegills or baby perch or baby crappie, whatever could be around those brush piles. They live in those brush piles. When the bait swims over the top of the brush pile, they'll come up and get the bait. So same thing, you can use a Damiki Rig for largemouth. You can even use the Damiki Rig for spotted bass as well if you fish in places like Lake Hartwell or any of those places in South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, that region there, even Alabama. When those spotted bass chase around blueback herring or shad or whatever your lake has, when they're chasing them around in the wintertime right now when it's cold, you can get on top of them with this Damiki Rig and catch a ton of fish doing that as well. So it is a technique that works for all three species. It works in the winter exceptionally well. That's when most people are going to throw this bait. Early spring, late fall, right through the heart of winter. That's going to be the time of year where this technique really excels. The rest of the year you could still catch fish on it, but it's not as popular. Many other techniques will work much better. So starting off with my rod and reel combo, this could not be a simpler technique to put a combo together for. Realistically, anything that you drop shot with, anything you fish your finesse swim baits on, anything you fish wacky rigs or shaky heads, that combo will work just fine. My setup that I really like to use for the Damiki Rig here, Shimano Sedona reel. I've talked about this a ton on the channel. Probably one of the best budget spinning reels ever made. I get a 2500 size, and then I put 15-pound lime green braid on it. That's like my go-to spinning rod or spinning reel setup. That's the way that I'm going to go with that pretty much always. And then I will put that on my rod, and at the end, I'm going to tie a fluorocarbon leader on here. Depending on what type of fish you're fishing for, what the clarity of water is, any of that stuff, that will determine how heavy of a leader and how long to put on there. Typically, I'm gonna put about a 15-foot leader on here. You could go a little bit longer if the water's even clearer, but about 15 foot is where I like to be. And the pound test that I'm gonna choose will vary based on the type of cover and areas I'm fishing in. My go-to is 8-pound test. You could go down to 6 if the fish are really finicky. You could go all the way up to 10 if you needed to land some bigger fish. Spinning rod here, super basic. This one's a custom one that I make myself, but I'll link down below one that I would recommend that's very similar to this one. This is a MHX rod from Mudhole that I built. It's my drop shot, wacky worm, finesse swim bait rod like I talked about. This is just a 7-foot medium action spinning rod, and it has a fast tip. That's very important. It has a decent amount of backbone in here too. It's not a rod that's like a noodle and flexes all the way through here. It flexes about the first half, maybe even first third of the rod, and that's it. It'll shut off into backbone the rest of the way in here. Even though these fish are directly underneath the boat, you're gonna get a good hook set, stuff like that. You need that backbone, especially if you're fishing for smallmouth bass. They have very thick mouths. Even though their mouths are small, they're very bony. You need that backbone to actually penetrate the fish's mouth on your hook set and get that hook barbed through their jawbone so that you can land these fish. So when it comes to jig head selection, this is probably the most important part of the Damiki rig, which seems really silly because it's just a jig head, but the jig head you choose is going to affect the action of your bait, especially because this is just a very do nothing, no action movement. What most important about your jig head is going to be your line tie. And as you'll notice, I have two jig heads right here. These are the two that I usually choose from. Both of these have a 90-degree line tie. That is absolutely crucial. You cannot have a jig head that has a 60-degree or a straight line tie, any of that. You want it straight vertical coming out of the bait, 90-degree line tie to tie your line to. Vertical dropping is going to be key. If you have that 90-degree line tie, it's going to hold your bait out in a natural position like it's swimming like a regular fish. If you have a 60-degree line tie, it's going to hold it like this and dangle, and it's going to look like that fish is always swimming upwards. That is very important. It's going to be a 90-degree line tie. The second thing that is very important on your jig head that is on both of these is an eyeball. You want an eyeball on this bait. You can choose your favorite jig head. If you want to use a round ball head jig, you can do that. It will work. But I highly recommend going to a jig head that has an eyeball, because these fish are going to be looking at this bait intently. They're not going to, it's not a reaction bait, it's not a moving bait, it's not even a dragging on bottom bait. These fish are going to get an extremely good look at this bait, so any little bit of realism will help. If you have that eyeball and it makes it look just a little bit more like a bait fish, you might get more bites than if you did not have an eyeball. So not saying you will always get more bites because of that, but I highly recommend going to a jig head that has an eye on it, just because of the fact that these fish are really gonna examine and look at this bait before they bite it. Now here's where the difference comes on these two jig heads. One right here, this is the VMC Neon Moon Eye jig. This jig head is probably one of the most popular Damiki Rig jig heads because of the big eyeball. It's very basic. It has a good hook in it. It has a 90-degree line tie. This one has a barb wire keeper here. There is nothing wrong with that keeper on there, and if you use these jig heads, go ahead and keep using them. They're very good. There's a ton of jig heads out there to choose from on the market. My favorite jig head for fishing a Damiki rig is actually going to be this guy right here, and this is the Pulse Fish Lures Finesse Swim Bait jig head. The difference here, instead of that barbed keeper, you have a screw lock on here. So not only is it going to keep your bait on there better, it helps open up the options of what bait you can actually put on this jig head. The big key with this one here, I absolutely love these screw lock keepers. So when we talk about bait selection, there's going to be some that are the Elastec. You have to fight it on this screw lock a little bit, but if you put that bait on there, that thing's never coming off. So an Elastec bait will last you an eternity on one of these. But there are other baits that I fish that are not Elastec, like some Zoom baits. If you put that on one of these barbed wire keepers here, if you don't put any super glue, you're gonna catch one or two fish, and then you're gonna have to replace your plastic over and over and over again. If you put it on this screw lock here, you're gonna be able to catch fish all day with that one jig head. That is why I like the screw lock a little bit better. If you're interested in getting any of these jig heads, you can use my code NQF10. You'll save 10% off your order, and this jig head will be linked to below to check out. When it comes to jig head size or color, realistically, that doesn't matter. I keep it pretty simple. I basically go either all white or like a plain natural lead color. It doesn't really matter what color jig head you use, just as long as you have that eye. What's more important with picking out a jig head for fishing the Damiki rig is the depth of water you're fishing and how active these fish are. you can choose different sizes of jig heads. The nice thing about these pulse fish jig heads as well, they come in a quarter, a 3/8, and a half. So if you really want to get that bait down there fast, you can go with a 1/2 ounce jig head, get that thing down to those fish quick. This is a vertical dropping technique. So the quicker you can get your bait down to those fish, the more you're going to catch oftentimes. Because if they disappear off your sonar, especially if you're using 2D, if you have that arch on your screen and it takes your bait 5 seconds to get down to that fish could be anywhere at that point. But if you have a bait that gets down there very quickly, you can get that bait in front of that fish as quick as you need to try and get them to react to it. Now, 1/2 ounce is a little bit extreme. I would recommend that if you're fishing in some very deep water. You can fish this technique as deep as you want. Since it's a vertical dropping technique, people fish this bait very, very deep. I usually fish it 15 to 30 foot on the lakes around here by my house. So if I'm fishing in that 10 to 20 foot zone, I'm probably just going to go with a 1/4 ounce jig head. That's all the more I need to get down there. The other really popular size is the 3/8. Honestly, if you had to get one, the 3/8 would probably be better, just because it gets down to the fish slightly quicker. So if you can get that bait down there just a little bit quicker to them, you're going to catch more. The other thing with the 3/8 ounce is you're going to be able to hold that bait in place a little bit easier. You don't want to impart much movement on this bait. That's very key with this technique, and we'll talk about that in the later video. But that 3/8 ounce option is going to allow you to hold it in place better than the 1/4 ounce if you're very new to fishing this technique or you're just trying to get a feel for it. Since it's much heavier, it's going to pull more tension on your rod. You're going to be able to feel it better and be able to produce the right action to catch more fish. So if you're just getting one jig head to get started, I'd highly recommend the 3/8 ounce. So the last thing we're going to talk about is our bait selection. There's a couple options out there. You can use a finesse swim bait if you want to. I would not use even the 3.2s from these Divine swim baits that I use. I would even use the 2.7. You want to go really, really small on this bait. They're looking for just tiny little snacks that they can eat on throughout the winter. So you could use the Divine swim baits. The other problem is you're going to get action out of the tail. Not really what you're looking for in this technique. So there are a couple plastics that I highly recommend when fishing this technique, and I believe there's one that's really exceptional, and it's usually the only one I fish. If you wanted to go really small on your bait, you're looking for the smallest profile you can get, I would recommend these guys right here, the Zoom Tiny Flukes. These are not the Super Flukes. They're the original Fluke, but they're the tiny version. They are so small, it's unbelievable. They're the smallest plastic you can get to put on this jig head. So if you need a very small bait fish profile, this is gonna be the only one you're gonna be able to find that will fit that bill. So I do carry those as my Damiki Rig baits sometimes. If you like Zoom products, Zoom Flukes, the Zoom Fluke Junior is also a great Damiki Rig plastic. Anything that's like about 3 inches long and looks like a minnow is going to be perfect, but this guy is the top of the choices right here. There's 2 versions of this. If you like Strike King baits, there's the Strike King Z2, the baby Z2, not the regular one, but the baby Z2 right here is a perfect option. That is that Elastec bait. This bait is also known as a Z-Man Streaks. That bait option is extremely similar, if not the exact same as this one right here. So if you like Z-Man baits, you could get that one as well, the 2.75 inch Streaks. Either one of those is going to be the ultimate Damiki Rig bait for a couple reasons. One, it's Elastec. So that thing, once you put that on that screw lock keeper, that thing's staying on there all day. And the second reason, when you tie this 90-degree line tie on here, if you put a plastic on there like a Zoom bait and it's salted, your tail will sag just a little bit, especially if you're holding this bait really still. This is just nitpicking. The Zoom baits will work very, very well. Your tail will sag just a little bit because it'll sink. If you're using this Z-Man bait, that bait's gonna sit horizontal in the water just like a fish, because that has the buoyancy in it that you need to get that bait to kind of float a little bit. So if you have the right jig head and a Z-Man plastic, that thing's gonna sit vertical or completely horizontal and look super natural to the fish down there. So when you're rigging one of these guys up, we'll show you real fast how to rig one up. Color selection, I keep it really simple. I either go pearl white or I go with like a natural bait fish color. I think this one right here is called Glimmer Blue is the other one that I have. realistically anything that looks like a baitfish or a shad. You do not need a fancy color or anything like that. Hang a white bait off the side of the boat and you're going to be good to go. I keep it really simple on color selection. When you're rigging this bait up, I saw a few comments on my last video talking about this jig head. Didn't really understand how the screw lock works. You're going to thread this bait on here like you would and try and keep it straight. Mark where the jig head is going to come out of the bait, and then you're just going to pop that free, and then you're going to bring it up to the screw lock and just twist it around a bunch of times until it works its way all the way up to the jig head. And then once you get it flat up against the jig head just like this, that's going to be staying on there all day long. And you just want to make sure that's straight when you put it on there. The Z-Man plastics make it a little bit tough just because they're very hard to get something through, whether it's a hook point or something, or even these screw locks. But if you take the time to just fight one on there a little bit, that thing's going to last you all day, and you're going to catch an absolute ton of fish on this technique throughout the winter. So hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you want to see the other use for this jig head about the finesse swim bait, go ahead and check this video out right here. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like down below. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more of my fishing videos coming up, and thanks for watching.